Welcome everyone. We'll get started right at 10:15. If you just want to put yourselves on mute and while the presentation's running, you can turn your camera off. We'll have time for some questions at the end. Thanks. Okay, good morning, everyone. It is 10:15. I think we'll go ahead and get started. We just have one or two housekeeping items, so if folks are still being let in through the waiting room, they won't miss the content of our talk. My name is Jen Denninger. I'm a watershed restoration specialist with Maryland Sea Grant Extension, and I'm one of the planners for the Chesapeake Watershed Forum. We're super grateful to everyone who signed up and has been attending all these great sessions. Just a few housekeeping notes. I think there might be on the next slide as well. All of our sessions are being recorded and they will be posted at a later date. If you don't want to be a movie star, you can please feel free to turn off your camera and just participate through audio or the chat. Everyone will be muted unless we're doing questions at the end. Please try to keep yourselves muted so that the speakers don't have a lot of distractions. We do ask if you wouldn't mind renaming yourself. You can do that by hovering your cursor over your own video block and hitting that button that has the 3 dots, and you can rename yourself with your name, your preferred pronouns, and the organization that you work for. And then there will be a link in the chat in a moment for the sked.com website that has the schedule for the remainder of today. And that's also where you will find the evaluation and a place to leave comments for today. I'm going to just let you know who our speakers will be all at once, because we have an awesome lineup. So I'm going to just tell you their names and where they're from, and then, well, actually, you can see them on the screen as well. So the facilitator for this session today will be Julie Reichert-Nguyen from the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office. Also, we have Dr. Krista Grocholski from RAND Corporation. We can go to the next slide. There we go. You can see Angela King is here from Virginia Coastal Policy Center. And then we have Dr. Katie Mae Lauman and Annie Carew, both from the UMC's Integration and Application Network. I also want to say a big thanks to Breck Sullivan, who's handling the Mentimeter process that we'll be doing today. And then Laura Knoll from the Alliance for the Chesapeake is our amazing technical facilitator. So she'll be handling all of the tech that we're working on today. So I'm going to pass it now to Julie, who will take it from here. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, thanks, Jen, and welcome, everyone. We're really excited about this session. We're going to be sharing with you some upcoming and also existing scorecard tools related to climate resilience and adaptation. And we thought we would use this session also as an opportunity, since these scorecards are in different phases of development and implementation. We want to also take an opportunity and have you participate and provide feedback and input on what you would like to see incorporated into these scorecards, and to help you build resilience within your own communities. So we have a jam-packed session. We are going to want it to be as much as interactive as possible in this virtual setting. So we are going to use a tool called Mentimeter. It's an interactive online polling tool, and it's really simple to use. So we're going to test it out right now to sort of see who's here in the session, where you're from, and the type of organization you're with, and also talk a little bit about climate resilience. So please, everyone, go to www.menti.com. And I believe it's also there in the chat. I see the link. You can do this either on a new tab on your browser, on your computer. You can also grab your smartphone if it's nearby, and you can put it on your smartphone as well. We do recommend that you keep the Mentimeter open once you enter that code. You can see the code there is 4245193, because we will be going back to it throughout the session. So the first question we had for you is, which state territory do you work in? So we want to get a sense who we have here. Listed are the Chesapeake Bay watershed states, but if you are from somewhere else, if there's an other there, you are more than welcome to. We want to hear your input as well. So I see we have a lot of Maryland folks. We have around 18 people. Virginia, 5 people. Pennsylvania, 3. 1 from Delaware. We'll give it another second for people to get onto Menti. All right, looks like we have a lot of Maryland folks. So you'll be hearing from Katie Mae and Annie about a Maryland coastal adaptation tool that they're developing. All right, 1 from West Virginia, welcome. All right, so we're gonna go on to the next question. We also want to get a sense of what type of organization you work for. When you're developing scorecards, it's always good to know your audience and potentially what would be the use for that scorecard with that audience. So we'll see how many folks we have from these different groups. So looks like we have a lot of nonprofit organizations. Have some local government, 6 people. State government, federal government, private industry, great. University, got some other. So it's like a large nonprofit audience. Give it a couple more seconds. All right, great. This really helps us to see sort of the audience here today as we take your input and your feedback and look at how we can incorporate it into these scorecards. So we're going to go on to the next Mentimeter question. So when we hear the term climate resilience, it means it can mean a lot of different things to different people. So we just want to get a sense, and when you hear the phrase climate resilience, what it means to you. So we're going to produce a word cloud here. So you can use 1 to 2 words, and I believe Breck set it up where you can put multiple words in as well. Oh, sustainable, love it. Yep. Adaptation, habitat, retreat. Oh yeah, we heard a lot about that in the plenary this morning, if you were able to attend, about looking into retreat as well. That in a sense, that is adaptation strategy when we're dealing with sea level rise. Survival. Oh, these are all great words. Community. Wow. Looks like adaptation is definitely, yeah, it's one up there. Green infrastructure, future. Funding, yes, funding will be important for climate resilience action. Sustainable and adaptation, yeah, it seems like a lot of folks, those words are resonating with them. And future. I see communities also up there. Fortunately, some of the words are tiny. I can't read all of them. Let me see if I can see a couple of them. Vulnerability, yes. All right, great. Thanks. So these are great words. If we can go to the next slide. If we go back to the Zoom slide. Yeah, so there's lots of definitions out there. And as we can see, there's a lot of words that resonate with people when you talk about climate resilience. But there are common themes when you're looking at these definitions across these different organizations. And we even saw that within the word cloud that we just did. So for the Chesapeake Bay program, for instance, they focus on looking at strategies to withstand impacts or recover and adapt to climate change impacts over time. We see similar themes within FEMA's definition: to adapt, to withstand, to rapidly recover from disruption due to emergencies. And if we look at the definition from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you also see some other words popping up there: to cope with these hazardous events, and to also maintain essential function, identity, and structure, but also maintain the capacity for adaptation. Another word we saw a lot in our word cloud: learning and transformation, which we heard a lot about that in the plenary as well, that concept of transformation. The capacity of cities to function, and also survive. We saw that word a lot: survive and thrive, and that's from the Rockefeller Foundation. Those are the words that resonate in their definition. Next slide. So for our session goals today, we want to be able to share some existing upcoming climate score related tools with you. And we also want to get your thoughts, as I said, on what you would like to see included in these climate resilience adaptation scorecards. A lot of them are still in the development phases, and even with some are where they're implementing, it's always good to know what resonates well with people and what will be useful to help build climate resilience in your communities. And with that, we want to generate ideas of how these scorecards could benefit your community in building climate resilience to climate change impacts. So now I'm going to hand over the presentation to Krista, and she's going to go over some some general concepts when you're talking about scorecards in a literature review that they've been doing.
Thanks, Julie. So hi, everyone. I'm Krista. You'll hear more from me at the end of this session today. But as part of the project that we recently started, that you'll hear more about later, we completed a literature review where we tried to understand kind of the breadth of resilience assessments that exist out there and have been done. So we looked, worldwide for these assessments. It wasn't just focused on what's been done in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so for a little bit of context, we wanted to share some of the results of our literature review. And there are a lot of different, we found there are a lot of different approaches that these assessments can take. And they can vary widely in kind of their complexity and how much data they require and how much work it takes to actually do them. But even within these kind of categories that we've identified. But we've kind of characterized them in these three ways with indices, which are generally more kind of numerical or data intensive in nature. And they tend to rely on statistics or kind of academic expertise in order to complete. Then there's scorecards, which can have multiple forms. Some of them take the form of a kind of a binary checklist, a yes/no kind of checklist. Others kind of have more of a rubric-like feel to them. And so depending on which one you're doing, you can imagine that a binary checklist would be less labor intensive to fill out. And a rubric, you might actually need to have a subject matter expert help you fill something like that out, depending on its complexity. So there's a lot of range in the kind of form that scorecards can take. And finally, there are frameworks, which are generally the most labor intensive, but are also the most holistic in their approach. And they tend to involve a series of evaluative components. And so it might start with something like a scorecard and then involve community interaction and incorporate things like interviews and speaking with community members. And I think RAFT is, which you'll hear about next, is a really nice example of a framework. Can we go to the next slide? So in our review of all the different kinds of scorecards or resilience assessment methods, we found that a few gaps exist. And this is not to say that this indicates a problem with any assessment methods that we looked at. It just, I think, is a reflection of how difficult the problem is, how hard it is to measure and assess resilience. And so the gaps that we found that we wanted to highlight for you all today are a lot of these assessments kind of necessarily measure the existence of plans or that there are activities ongoing, but have a limited ability to measure the quality of those plans or activities, and or if, in some cases, if any of the plans have actually been implemented. So it's like, say, in something like a binary checklist, you could say, yes, we've written a resilience plan, but there's often not a place for you to say, okay, well, what did you do with it? The nature of resilience is that it varies spatially and temporally. And just by the nature of conducting assessment in a particular moment in time, it's hard to get that temporal aspect reflected in your assessments. And you kind of have to pick a region or a location to do your assessment over. And so it's hard to also get the spatial component in your assessments as well. And so given there were a few other gaps that we found as well, but generally they all relate to this larger question that sometimes remains unanswered with some of these assessment methods is, have communities been made more resilient based on what's been done with these assessments? So that's something for all of us to kind of keep in mind. So, next slide, please. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of lessons learned, which can kind of be summed up as assessing resilience is hard. So, but there's a couple of ways in which it's hard. That these assessments and scorecards take time for a combination of experts and communities to fill out, and it can be difficult to also develop actionable recommendations as an outcome. So that's why I think some of the frameworks that are more labor intensive and take more time can sometimes be more effective because they kind of help you get to that next stage. Necessarily, as you could see in all of your responses to what climate resilience means to you, is resilience is multifaceted. So it's hard to capture everything that goes into resilience in a single assessment. Resilience is also context specific, so it's hard to create general tools that work over large areas because what you're facing is different than what your neighbor might be facing, and what your resources are might be different than what your neighbor's resources are. So resilience is really context specific, and that can be difficult to see reflected in these assessments. And something else that we learned is that community to community learning is really key in getting to the next step of translating your assessment into action for improving your climate resilience. And I think that is it for reviewing our literature review. If you have any questions about that, I can try to answer it. Ultimately, we will be making the results publicly available, so stay tuned for that. But I think we're going to go over to a new Mentimeter question. Let's head over to that. Okay, so could you guys just let us know if, to your knowledge, whether you know of climate resilience being measured in your region or your community? If you do not know, that is totally okay. Let's see. This is just for us to get a sense of the lay of the land and or how well this is being communicated. So I'm seeing the number of responses coming in, but nothing being shared. Perhaps this is because people are answering not yes or no, but rather I don't know. Breck, is that one of the options for this question?
I don't believe so. I'm trying to figure out what's going on.
Okay.
This is Laura. I can try to unshare and share again and see if that works.
Yeah, it's worth a shot. Let's try it. And please keep entering your answers if it's working on Mentimeter, because that's data that we will still get even if we're not seeing it right now. So hey, there we go. Look at that. Oh, great. Seems like, yes, climate resilience activities are being measured, which is wonderful. Wonderful to hear. Okay, great. So I'm going to pass this back to Julie, I believe.
Yeah, thanks, Krista. Yeah, so that's great to see that there are actually assessment activities going on around climate resilience in your region. I'm going to pause here to make sure there's not any questions before we go to the next Zoom slide. And I seem like I may be frozen. I'm not sure if people can hear me. So a quick yes, we can hear you would be great as
Julie,
well.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Don't see you. Yeah.
And Julie, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet, so you're good to go for now.
Okay, great. And it looks like my internet is picked up again. Wonderful. So if we could go to the next Zoom slide. So yeah, we have here today some great examples of existing and upcoming tools that we wanted to feature during this session. The first one that's going to be covered is the Resilience Adaptation Feasibility Tool, commonly referred to as RAFT. And this tool is available for Virginia coastal communities. So maybe some folks here even in the session today have heard of it. And also, Angela is going to cover some implementation and equity considerations that they had in their tool. We're also going to feature the Maryland Coastal Adaptation Report Card. So this report card is under development for Maryland coastal counties. And Katie May and Annie are going to be sharing some stakeholder experience and also use this opportunity to identify some climate change threats that may be of concern to folks here on the session. We're also going to talk about the Chesapeake Bay Program Climate Resilience Scorecard, and this is also under development for Chesapeake Bay Watershed Communities. And we're viewing our scorecard as sort of a conversation starter and connecting interests and local priorities with management outcomes that we're responsible for. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Angela, who's going to talk about RAFT.
Thank you, Julie, and good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Angela King, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Virginia Coastal Policy Center at William & Mary Law School. And I'm here today to talk to you about a collaborative project that we and our partners at Old Dominion University and the University of Virginia do called the RAFT. Next slide, please. So we'll just start with the purpose of the RAFT. The Resilience Adaptation Feasibility Tool is a full service tool meant to help localities improve their resilience to flooding and other coastal storm hazards, while at the same time helping them remain economically and socially viable. And the motivation behind the creation of this project is really the fact that coastal Virginia is seeing an increase in flooding risk, both from sources such as sea level rise, as well as increased precipitation. And this is something that the collaborative team, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, tries to communicate early on with the communities that we engage with. In order to set the foundation for the overall purpose of the project, we use historic data as well as future projections to connect what the people in the community are experiencing on the ground now to what they could be facing in the future. And then we build off this common understanding to determine actions that could be taken to assist the community moving forward. And something to keep in mind when we talk about resilience is that we're thinking broadly. We approach community resilience in coastal areas as the capacity to anticipate threats, reduce the community's vulnerability, and respond to or recover from both hazardous events as well as chronic stresses. And we also like to point out that a community can be vulnerable not only due to physical location or infrastructure, but also due to social factors within the community, such as the ability for residents to have access to transportation or medical fragility. Next slide, please. The RAFT is managed by an academic collaborative team that includes us at VCPC, as well as the Virginia Sea Grant Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program at Old Dominion University, and the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation at the University of Virginia. And having partners at multiple universities increases our capacity to work with multiple localities at one time. And then all of us also bring different skill sets to the table. For example, among other things, ODU provides science and risk communication, as well as community engagement support. VCPC can provide legal research and policy analysis assistance, and IEN can focus on facilitation and planning assistance. Next slide, please. And the full service nature of the project really takes shape through the 3-phase process that's involved. This includes utilizing the RAFT scorecard to conduct a resilience assessment, then holding a community workshop to develop what we call a resilience action checklist. This is a list of items that could be Completed or significant progress could be made on them within the course of a year and ultimately would help to improve the community's resilience. And then the third step is providing ongoing implementation assistance to those communities for 1 year. As we work through these steps, our focus is really on expanding the conversation around resilience and to support the community in taking the lead on identifying what their priority actions are. And now I'll spend the next few minutes focusing more on step 1 and how the scorecard was developed. And then I'll end by briefly covering how we use the scorecard and the resilience assessment in steps 2 and 3 of the RAFT. Next slide, please. So to develop the scorecard, graduate planning students at the University of Virginia researched and compared existing scorecards and assessment tools. So rather than recreate the wheel, the RAFT team wanted to utilize existing information and build on what had already been accomplished in other areas. So in addition to reviewing these existing tools and assessments, the students also interviewed the developers and users of these items to gather feedback and lessons learned. We were also assisted by an advisory committee and 2 focus groups to help determine the exact structure and content of the RAFT scorecard. The advisory committee included professors from UVA, ODU, Virginia Tech, William and Mary, VIMS, and Louisiana
Hi, is this
State.
Maria?
I'm sorry?
Hi, this is Sue.
Oh, okay. And their fields of study included architecture, landscape architecture, planning, environmental sciences, engineering, and water quality, just to name a few. The first focus group that we interacted with was composed of representatives from coastal local governments, nonprofit organizations, and related state agencies. And the purpose of that first focus group was to ground truth the content of the scorecard and determine how to make it more relevant and applicable to Virginia's coastal localities. Next slide, please. Now, with the second focus group, we brought together nonprofit, academic, and community representatives to review the scorecard for its sufficiency in addressing social equity concerns. We asked them to review the current format of the scorecard and consider how it did or did not address social equity. The biggest question we had for them really was whether we should have a separate section of the scorecard that was all about social equity, or if we should instead reference social equity considerations throughout the scorecard as they were applicable. And the overwhelming response, 100%, was that social equity should not be a separate standalone section, that it should instead be integrated into each category as it applies. So typically what this has meant for our scorecard is that the scoring metrics regarding how vulnerable populations are treated will include details like whether or not the locality has identified vulnerable populations in a certain area, and then how those populations are included within assessment and planning processes, and how the concerns that those populations raised are incorporated as the locality moves forward on planning and implementation. Next slide, please. So based on the feedback from the advisory committee and these focus groups, we ultimately settled on 5 broad categories, and these include environmental, economic, and social factors. The first category listed here looks at policies and ordinances that are in place for coastal resilience, coordination and collaboration between different levels of government, and how accessible and open data is to the public. The second category examines how well a locality has conducted risk assessments, how they have identified vulnerable populations, and how they've developed plans for disaster preparedness. The third category looks at critical infrastructure, so things like transportation, emergency services, and water supply. And again, assesses how well the locality has identified methods and plans for protecting this critical infrastructure. The fourth category focuses on land use, planning, and incentives. So in this category, we look at things like the locality's comprehensive plan to see how they're addressing resilience. And then in the fifth category, we're looking at how well the community engages with residents and planning, how they support or empower residents to provide leadership in this area, and then also a big focus on social equity as far as examining the locality's attention to issues of health and wellness during and after coastal events. And each of these 5 categories includes 5 sections, and each section has a total of 4 possible points. And then overall, there's 100 possible points in total for the scorecard. Next slide. One thing that we've done recently is incorporate the following icons into the scorecard. We did this just to point out different elements that are related to a specific subject matter. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read these out to you, but just point out that we have done this. And if you look at the scorecard, you may see some of these things sprinkled throughout. Next slide, please. All right, so this is what one of the sections of the scorecard looks like. This is the general heading of the section. This one is 2.4 about hazard mitigation. Below the heading, there's a general explanation of how the topic relates to resilience. And then the table for each section has 4 columns. The first column is where we would input the number of points that the locality has received for that section. For example, 0 would mean they did not get a point for that section. 1 if the point was awarded. We have run into a few instances where we've put not applicable if it hasn't applied to the locality. And as a result, we do a percentage-based score rather than X out of 100. And the second column is where we would include those icons that were on the previous slide. Here you see the vulnerable population icon is listed. The third column is the scoring metric that we're looking at for that item. And the fourth column is a notes column where we can provide further explanation regarding why we did or did not award the point. And we'll also include the source of the information that we used. Next slide, please. So to do the assessment, we utilize law students from William & Mary, and they conduct an independent review of what the locality is currently doing with respect to various elements of resilience. They conduct a 2-step scoring process. First, they do online research and see what they can find on their own related to the locality. This might be collecting different ordinances or plans, looking at the locality's website. And as they're collecting that information, they're also compiling a list of questions, either information that they're not able to find or information that maybe they're unsure of how to interpret. And then in the second phase, we reach out to locality staff and do a brief interview with them to fill in any remaining gaps or gather additional detail that they may have. Next slide, please. And then once we have this baseline assessment in hand, but before we move on to step 2 of holding the community workshop, we present our findings to the locality's governing body. So their board of supervisors or their town or city council. And we provide them with general background on the RAFT project. We identify the locality's strengths and opportunities based off the scorecard. Generally, the strengths are those sections where they've scored a 3 or a 4. And the opportunities are those sections where they have scored a 2 or below. And then once we've had this interaction with the local elected officials, we move on to the second phase of holding the community workshop. The purpose of this workshop is to bring together various members of the community. This may include locality staff, local electeds, business owners, residents, nonprofits, state agency representatives, etc. We present the findings of the scorecard, and then we provide a space for the attendees to take the lead on developing that resilience action checklist. And as I mentioned earlier, this is just a list of about 5 items that could be implemented or progress could be made on them over the course of the next year and would ultimately improve the community's resilience. Another important outcome of the workshop is the identification of an implementation team for the community. And this is a group of people that we'll work with in step 3 to help track progress on the checklist items. So in the third step, implementation assistance, the collaborative team holds check-in calls with the locality's implementation team, and we provide assistance as needed for the checklist items. We've assisted with the development of emergency communication products, identification of funding opportunities, citizen education regarding green infrastructure, and model language for comprehensive plans, just to name a few. Ultimately, the type of assistance that we provide really depends on what the community includes on their checklist. Next slide. And this is just a screenshot or some screenshots from the RAFT website. I think Jen might share it via the chat in case you're interested in checking it out. You'll be able to see the communities that we've worked with, their scorecards, their checklists, as well as some of the implementation products that we've put together. And that's a really quick rundown of the RAFT, and more specifically the RAFT scorecard. And we do have some polling questions for you.
Yeah, Angela, before we jump into that, we actually have a couple of questions in the chat for you. So I figure maybe we'll do those first, and then we can jump to the Menti poll.
Yeah.
So one of the questions we have is from Kevin Jenkins. He asks, has this been used with Navy installations in collaboration with ODU? And Kevin, feel free to unmute yourself and turn your camera on if you want to elaborate more on your question.
A quick answer is no, it has not been used with Navy installations in collaboration with ODU. The content of the scorecard is very focused on the local government level. So looking at, what is within their ordinances, what is within their planning documents, like their comprehensive plan. We have worked with a variety of localities. Whenever we first piloted the project, we worked with a city, a county, and a town, the city of Portsmouth, Gloucester County, and the town of Cape Charles. We selected those three because they were the three different types of localities in Virginia, as well as they were located in different regions of our coastal region. And then after that, we did a regional approach out on the Eastern Shore. And we're currently working on another regional approach in the Northern Neck of Virginia. We're in phase 3 right now of implementation with the Northern Neck localities and hoping to start up step 1 with the Middle Peninsula localities in the spring.
Hey, Angela, this is Kevin, and I appreciate the response. The reason I asked was because Zoe Johnson and myself were working with the city of Annapolis, and the city of Annapolis kind of had to rate themselves on how they were doing from a resilience aspect as they applied for an OEA grant for funding of planning and design of projects. So I think you're onto something here. Reference a scorecard and how communities would score themselves, on a scale, and would have been very useful, for them. I think in the presentation of their case, so to speak, of hey, we're a resilient community, we're doing these things in their assessment. But good presentation and very appreciated. The reason I asked about ODU is because I know they were in a cooperative with several of the Navy installations in the Norfolk Hampton Roads area to help them with a lot of the projects that they're trying to initiate kind of on the governmental side. But this is this was a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. And I would say, as you can tell from the regions that we've been working with and plan to work with, our focus has been more on the rural localities. We've sort of found that that's where we can be of the most assistance, at least at this point in the process.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. We have a couple more questions. Gabe, I'm going to hold your question off to the end because I think that'd be a great question for the entire group towards the end of the session. But Maya asks, does your scorecard include the need to reduce emissions or even mention emissions in it?
Right, so that is a great question. It currently does not focus on that aspect of climate change. We're really focused on flooding and coastal storms. We continue to have conversations about expanding the types of climate impacts that we're looking at within the scorecard, but it becomes an issue of capacity for us since we're typically juggling 2 different regions at a time that are in different steps of the 3-step process. But we definitely have it like on our radar to expand what we're looking at, to also look at heat as one of the factors, and thinking about ways that we can tweak the scorecard to do that.
I think in the interest of time, we should probably move to the poll questions, and then we can address some of the questions that are in the chat when we get to the end.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jen.
Okay, so if you could go back to the Mentimeter site. And our first question for you is a multiple choice question. Which climate resilience assessment approach would you prefer? Self-assessment, meaning it's done by your organization, maybe using instructions from the developer of the scorecard, or having the scorecard developer conduct the assessment and provide the findings back to your organization. And this is actually a question that has come up at different times during the RAFT process. We do the assessment in-house. We have law students do it, of course. And we find that having that objective assessment done by academic institutions in some cases gives it more credibility. We also have found that it helps out with capacity issues with some of the localities that we're working with, that they may not have staff time that could be devoted to completion of the scorecard assessment. And it looks like most of the responses that are coming in are going with assessment done by the scorecard developer. Right. Rather than self-assessment. All right, and then we have one more polling question here that's a little bit more open-ended. And just based on the responses that we had from the first question, more people selected the option to have the developer conduct the assessment. So for this second question, I'd like to hear from you about what might limit the ability of you or your organization to actually take on a self-assessment. What are some of the challenges or barriers that might exist? Obvious ones, time or funding. That's what we found during the RAFT process as well. Funding. And I didn't really talk a lot about the funding of the RAFT, but there is no charge to localities to participate in this process. The academic team obtains grants to do the RAFT. We just ask for time to present to their local governing body or to their staff. And of course, staff time to do the interview with our students as they're completing the assessment. And then to the extent that staff or elected officials are on the locality's implementation team, about an hour's worth of time each month to attend those calls. It looks like capacity, time, resources are the common threads that I'm seeing here in the responses. All right. Thank you all for that feedback. Geographic differences I'm seeing, willingness to participate was another piece of feedback that we've received. And we have found that we've had to take different approaches with different localities in order to do things like schedule the presentation to their governing body. But that's all part of adapting to the process and sort of meeting them where they are. All right. And it's hard for me to tell if answers are still coming in, but.
I think
we've leveled off on answers at this point.
And I think we should probably move on to the next speaker if possible.
All right. Well, with that, I'll hand it over to Katie May to talk about the Maryland Coastal Adaptation Report Card. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Hi, I'm Katie May Lauman. I am a science integrator at UMCs at the Integration and Application Network, and I'll be presenting today with Annie.
Hi everyone, I'm Annie Carew. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a science communicator at the Integration and Application Network.
So Annie and I are working on the Maryland Coastal Adaptation Report Card from the University of Maryland side. And next slide. I'll start out today talking a little bit about who we are at IAN, and then we'll introduce our project, and finally we'll come to a point where we'll ask you all for some help. Next slide. So the Integration and Application Network is a group of scientists that work to solve and study environmental problems. And we work to inspire others by producing ecosystem health assessments and through science communication courses. We partner with stakeholders around the world to conduct these assessments and to distribute their results in a number of ways, including ecosystem health report cards. Next slide. We work worldwide, and we've produced ecosystem health report cards in Samoa, India, Australia, and of course in the US, in Mississippi, Oregon, and the Gulf of Mexico, for example. Next slide. But of course, we have a special focus for our home base, which is Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay. You may have seen our Chesapeake Bay report cards or our Maryland Coastal Bays report cards before, and we work with community members to produce these. I'll discuss the process a bit more in a few minutes. But we also work with the National Park Service in Maryland, assessing conditions of both natural and cultural resources in the parks. So we're not only focused on natural resources, we are focused on cultural issues and understanding how the natural and human environments interact and rely on one another. Next slide. Developing our ecosystem health report cards is a 5-step process, and I'll go through each one of these steps in a little bit more detail. But the first step is conceptualization, and then choosing indicators, determining thresholds, calculating grades or scores, and finally communicating. And each of these steps relies on stakeholder input. Next slide. So step 1, conceptualize. First with our partners, so whoever it is that has spearheaded wanting a report card or a scorecard, we work with those partners to conceptualize what it is we're looking at and evaluating, what ecosystem and what human communities depend on it. Next slide. The next step is to determine how we're going to measure overall ecosystem health. And this involves identifying what parts of the ecosystem are vital, measurable, and important to the community. So we hold workshops with community members to identify these indicators, and those indicators are what we will eventually be using to evaluate ecosystem health. So for example, in the Chesapeake Bay, aquatic grasses or seagrasses, as some of us call them, are particularly important in the ecosystem because they are a blue carbon sink. They're really good at slowing down wave action and helping reduce flooding. So because seagrasses were identified as something extremely important, we decided we might want to use how many acres of seagrass we have in the bay as an indicator. But how do we know if the amount that we have is healthy? Next slide. So we compare our current condition, so how many acres of seagrass do we have now, to threshold or goal conditions. And thresholds are based on science, but again, we involve stakeholders because we need agreement among the stakeholders, including scientists, policymakers, and other community members to establish a goal. So for example, sticking with seagrass, we're going to compare the number of acres of seagrass that are currently present to the restoration goal. And the restoration goal has been set by policymakers and agreed upon with many community members. So next slide. So to calculate a score, we take this comparison, we look at what percent of the way to the goal are we, and that essentially gives us a score from 0 to 100%. So if we have 80% of the goal number of acres of seagrasses, then our score would be 80%. And this, of course, can translate to a letter grade. which we put into our report cards because they're easy to understand and they're something that pretty much everybody can look at and say, oh, okay, an A is good and F is a fail. Next slide. Then we bring together all of the indicator scores to get an overall ecosystem score, and we produce a publication, which is usually a report card, and that report card is distributed among and beyond the community. And they're often used in management and to advise policymakers on what it is that communities need to improve ecosystem conditions. Of course, the key, as I've said before, is stakeholder engagement. I told you that stakeholders are involved in the process of choosing indicators and threshold goals to calculate scores. And we also bring in stakeholders to help advise us when we do calculate scores and quantify ecosystem health. And that's because the people in the community and the people who rely on an ecosystem know more about it and know what's valued in it than we necessarily do coming in from Maryland. For example, if we go to the Mississippi River, they know more about what they value than we do. Next slide. So, sorry, next slide. So our Maryland Coastal Adaptation Report Card is a collaboration between UMC's Ian, the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, and the Adaptation and Resiliency Working Group. And this is supported by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources using federal funds from NOAA. And essentially, with this project, we're evaluating how well adapted Maryland's coastal communities are for climate change. And what that means is not just if adaptation plans exist, but how effective they are, and whether or not adaptation actions have been put into place and whether those actions are adequate, with the overall aim to improve and increase effective adaptation within communities. And by increasing adaptation, that will build resilience. So I'll hand it over to Annie.
Thanks, Katie Mae. Next slide. Yeah, so basically the reason that this project is necessary and important is that we're already seeing the effects of climate change in coastal regions in Maryland and throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. There are a lot of different things about climate change effects that severely impact the coast and coastal communities, and a huge percentage of the human population lives within 50 miles of the coastline. So these issues are extremely relevant to all of us and our society and our livelihoods. So some of the effects that we might see include, more frequent and severe storms that lead to storm surges and flooding, which can bring about coastal erosion and wetland loss associated with sea level rise, saltwater intrusion also associated with sea level rise, changes in biotic communities, species migration, and these things can all lead to human property damage and loss of life, both human and non-human. Next slide. So there's already been some climate adaptation actions taken in coastal regions, including wetland restoration and coastal forest restoration, shoreline protection actions, including vegetated buffers and the use of riffraff and other erosion barriers, living shorelines, that sort of thing. Clean energy investment, such as solar and wind power, green infrastructure actions, such as rain gardens and stormwater management, as well as permeable pavement and the energy stuff that I was just talking about, and emergency action plans put in place to deal with these increasingly frequent and severe natural events, such as the storms that I was talking about earlier. Next slide. So the question that this project is asking is, how do we assess the progress of coastal adaptation and the success and efficacy of the actions that are being taken? We need to find out how effective these actions are and track them as adaptation increases. We're asking what measures for climate adaptation are being taken already, how effective are they, and what more can and should we be doing? Next slide. This brings us back to the key step of the report card process, which is stakeholder input. We are currently beginning steps 2 and 3 of this process, choosing indicators and threshold goals. And stakeholder input is absolutely vital to this part of the process. Next slide. With this in mind, we want to emphasize to you all our commitment to diversity and equity, inclusion and justice in this project. Coastal and climate change will disproportionately impact low-income communities and communities of color because of historic and systemic inequities in resource allocation and infrastructure. These communities are more vulnerable to climate change and coastal change. Therefore, it is vital that we include their voices and input on this project. And we ask that our project partners and cooperators and participants share this commitment to diversity and inclusion. Next slide. So we need to keep that commitment in mind as we move forward with our stakeholder engagement. And I'm going to hand it back to Katie May now.
Like Annie said, please keep that in mind. And we're moving forward into the step where we need your help. You all are stakeholders, whether or not you live in coastal Maryland. We want to hear from you. And we have some questions that'll be coming up in a second on Mentimeter that we'll ask you to answer.
While we switch over, there is one question that I think probably we're about to answer, but the question is, have the EN indicators been completely defined yet, as your mission was defined earlier this year?
No, so actually what we're about to do right now is work with everyone on this call to define some indicators. And in the next 3 weeks, we'll be holding broader stakeholder workshops that are open to anyone who lives, works, or studies in coastal Maryland or otherwise depends on coastal Maryland's resources. So we're asking you all and then future or further stakeholders to tell us what should the indicators be. And in order to do that, first, we need everyone to think about what are the biggest threats of climate change to their community. So if you can list those in your Mentimeter and try to keep it to 2 or 3 words only.
And just a time check, Annie and Katie May, we have about 7 minutes left in this session, in this section.
Okay. So I'm seeing flooding is the biggest word here. So the most people are saying flooding, and we have sea level rise and storms, as well as heat, habitat loss. Seafood industry decline is a little bit smaller, but that's definitely an important part. So what we'll do is, you continue responding, is we'll take all of your responses and work with stakeholders to put them into categories. So for example, storms, stormwater runoff, and managing stormwater are 3 different items I see here. And we might put those all into one category and say, well, how do we measure how we control stormwater runoff? How do we measure how prepared we are for major storms? We might look at flooding and say, okay, flooding is a major risk. Everyone's concerned about flooding, it seems. How prepared are we for flooding? What is the government or the community doing in your county to help protect you and your community against flooding? And this would lead us into identifying indicators. So we'll go into the next question. So thinking about those major threats, flooding, threats to the seafood industry, urban heat islands, increasing temperatures, stormwater, how is your community addressing these? And if they aren't addressing these, how should they address these? Meetings. do you know of any concrete actions that are being taken or any that you wish would be taken? So you can keep answering. I'm seeing a lot of green infrastructure, living shorelines, outreach. So we've thought about those threats, and now we've come up with ideas of how they are or could be addressed. Plantings, trees, replacing infrastructure or new infrastructure, invasive species removal. So these are all items that could actually be used to generate indicators. We might say, for green infrastructure, how would we measure green infrastructure? Does anyone have an idea of what we might want to look at in a county to quantify a score for green infrastructure? So what we might say is, okay, yes, green infrastructure is being done. How much is being done? What is the estimate for how much green infrastructure we need in this county or in this coastal community? And how many of the planned green infrastructure activities have actually been put into place? With living shorelines, we might say what % of our shorelines are living shorelines. And with trees, tree plantings, we see here, and removal of invasives, those all kind of go together. So we could say how many trees are being planted versus how much of our natural vegetation is being lost, how much of the natural vegetation is being replaced by invasive species, and how many invasives are being removed each year in each county to help control the types of plants that we have. So we can go back to the main presentation. So what just happened? We asked you some questions that kind of seem random, but what we just did was a mini version of our stakeholder workshops. And what we would do then, continuing on with the workshop, is take your answers to those questions and split you into groups to think about and discuss each one, and have you all as stakeholders work together to distill them down into actual indicators that you'd like us to investigate. And then, of course, we would pull in more of the Ian team to look at the results from this workshop, and we would go through and see if there are any indicators that may be missing or weren't seen. We don't expect that to be an issue with this report card, because we had today hearing from all of you, and we're having at least 2 more stakeholder workshops before we narrow down the indicators. Next slide. So once we narrow down indicators and we have a list of them, we will be changing our process a bit. Usually our workshops are in person, but because of COVID, everything is remote. So in addition to having stakeholder workshops, we'll be putting up polls and surveys on our website, asking people to vote and react to indicators so we can finally come up with the short list of them. And we'll be working with stakeholders to identify those indicator thresholds in further workshops. And once we have those identified, of course, we'll move on to calculating the grades and working with any stakeholders who are interested in continuing on with the communications plan, building the report card itself. Next slide. So what we ask of you is to please stay involved. Check our website. You can see the link up on the screen. Refer anyone you know or any organization you know that might be interested in participating in this effort to us. And if you want to participate in a full workshop, please go ahead and sign up for it, which you can do on our website. We are about to put out some flyers advertising workshops and asking for participation. So if you'd like to distribute those flyers, or if you just want a PDF of them to share with your friends in various groups that you're a member of, please send us an email at the address on the screen, and we'll make sure to get those PDFs back out to you. Do we have time for questions? Or do we have any questions?
I think we may have covered the questions while we were going through your presentation. I don't see any new ones in the chat. There has been some really great questions that was earlier on that we're going to ask the whole group once we get through the last presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Please stay involved. And I guess we pass it back to Krista.
Yep, thanks, Katie Mae. Yeah, so we're going to hand over to Krista now, who's going to talk about the effort to build a Bay-wide scorecard to track climate resilience in watershed communities.
Great. So thanks, everyone. Thanks. Well, anyway, so I'll just come back and say I want to take a couple of minutes to make you all aware of this is an ongoing project that we're really just, several months into, and so I want to make sure that you, one, know that this is happening, and two, we would really like to get some early feedback and information from you all, and tell you how you can be involved. We're still in the early stages of this project, so we're really mostly advertising at this point. So can we go to the next slide, please? So just to introduce to all of you, this is our project team. So I'm Krista Romita Grocholski, and I work at the RAND Corporation. And if you are not familiar with RAND, it is a nonpartisan nonprofit research institution. I'm based in the Arlington, Virginia office, but we have several offices throughout the country, and we've been in existence doing policy-related research for over 70 years. I've been co-leading the project with Michelle Myro, who's also at RAND, and also working with some fabulous Virginia Institute of Marine Science colleagues, Molly Mitchell, Pam Mason, and Ben Watson, who's kind of co-supported by Penn State University. We've been working really closely with Julie, who's here today, and Breck, who's been our Mentimeter guru. And so I wanted to pass back to Julie for a second for the next slide, so she can provide some context of like where the origins of this project and why we're doing this.
Hi, thanks, Krista. Yeah, so this project's being endorsed by the Climate Resiliency Work Group with the Chesapeake Bay program. And there was a lot of interest in trying to figure out how are we going to track progress in how well we're building resilience in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And this really stems from the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. We have some outcomes that we're responsible for that includes monitoring assessment and also adaptation. So monitoring assessment essentially states that we're going to continuously monitor and assess the impacts of these changing climate conditions and sea level rise conditions on the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem, and try to get a sense of the effectiveness of our restoration and protection policies. And for adaptation, we want to continually pursue design and construct restoration and protection projects to enhance the resiliency of the bay and aquatic ecosystems from these impacts, a lot of which that you indicated in the word cloud we just did with Katie Mae and Annie. Really, for the Chesapeake Bay program, we have a lot of responsibilities in making sure that we are building resilience to protect our habitats, our living resources, our fisheries, and also our communities. So our work group very much focused on that, and we're working with RAND and VIMS to help develop a scorecard that can look at local priorities and connect it to sort of these management outcomes that we're responsible for and build resilience in our communities.
So can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So just quickly going through just the goals of the project and some things that we're still thinking about. So basically, we're trying to develop a scorecard or assessment method for climate resilience that works for decision makers and planners and other folks across the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. We know that'll be quite the challenge, but we're excited to take it on. We want to be able to provide communities across the watershed with a unified approach for tracking their climate resilience. And so that's really just in a nutshell what we're trying to do with this project. That being said, we acknowledge that the watershed's a kind of a big place and a very diverse place. And so it's going to, the scorecard or assessment method that we develop will necessarily need to be flexible so that it can be applied to inland areas as well as coastal areas and all of the places in the watershed. So, because we know that not only are these locations diverse, but the stakeholders are as well. So we'll need to keep that in mind as we move forward. And it's actually something that we will be wanting your input on in our next Mentimeter question. So keep that in mind. Something that we will also be providing at the end of the project, not only the building blocks of the scorecard, but a roadmap for its implementation. So let's go to the next slide. So just to give you a sense of where we are with things, this project started in May, so right after we all started working from home, and we've extended it to run through November 2021. And so due to COVID, we had to kind of change gears. In our original conception of the project, we were going to do a 2-day workshop with a bunch of stakeholders and kind of get everyone in the same room and talk to everyone all at once, but that's not a thing anymore. So we've had to switch over to doing a series of virtual engagements with stakeholder groups. So that's going to take us a little bit more time because we're going to have to do multiple rounds, and we had to figure out how we were going to do that. So this project will be running for just about another year or so. And so there are 4 steps to this project, and you can see on my little timeline at the bottom that we are at the end of step 1, which for us was forming a steering committee. And we took some time to find folks representing states across the watershed, and some folks who from the Bay program and represent the entire kind of Bay perspective, and doing some background research, particularly the literature review that I mentioned earlier today. And so now we're heading into a part of the project that I'm very excited about. It's kind of the meat of the project, which is the stakeholder engagement piece. We are reaching out to our steering committee members and to you all to potentially help us figure out who we should be talking to as we figure out what aspects should go into this scorecard, and who should be even filling out such a scorecard. So this will continue into the summer. And then we'll head into step 3 with all of the wonderful things that we learned from our engagement sessions, where we actually sit down and develop and hash out what goes into this scorecard. And then we will, of course, synthesize our findings and get it out into the world. So, next slide, please. But right now, I wanted to highlight for you all, in case you had some opinions or thoughts, that these are some key questions that we are currently considering. So we're wondering at this stage of the game, how can a scorecard best support climate resilience activities and be integrated into current planning and decision-making processes? You guys mentioned some barriers earlier, one of them being resources and time related. And so if we can make this something that can get folded into current processes, we hope that maybe if that's something that's possible, then maybe it'll reduce some of those barriers to implementation. We also asked you about this before, so I will definitely be looking closely at your responses to who should participate in the assessment and who will conduct the scorecard assessment. It sounded like during the RAFT presentation that not putting the burden on localities is important to everyone. But if anyone has any additional feedback or wants to elaborate, I'd be happy to hear that. And then we're still determining how and what should be measured for climate resilience. So those are the things that we're thinking about these days. I want to thank you all in advance if for your participation today and your inputs. My email is the kristarg@rand.org, so feel free to contact me if you're interested in participating in a stakeholder engagement session, or if you have suggestions for folks that I should reach out to that should be participating, or if you have any other inputs on the scorecard, I would love to hear it. But for now, I think we're going to switch over to Mentimeter and ask you a question about including equity, sorry, diversity and inclusion and environmental justice into the scorecards. This is something that the project team is new to, and we know that the folks at the forum have been having some really good discussions about this. So we wanted to get your input and have you help us get started on this. So I will be quiet for a few minutes while you all answer the Mentimeter question.
Krista, while folks are doing that, there is one question in the chat, which is, how do you define resilience? Are you providing examples of what resilience looks like, and how can you measure resilience?
That's a great question. And those are the questions that we're trying to answer a lot right now. In our literature review, we found many definitions of resilience. And so it's something we'll be discussing with stakeholders about and trying to come up with a definition that works well for the region. And so, we don't have examples of what resilience necessarily looks like yet, but that could be something that we provide as part of the scorecard. And I think one of our key questions is, how are we measuring resilience? So yeah, those are some things that we're hoping to try to answer throughout the course of the project. So I'm seeing a lot of answers coming in. Thank you. Community engagement, prioritizing people of color's perspectives, expanding diversity. Let's see. Indicators about the income levels of communities. Sounds good. Let's see. Prioritize people over habitat. Okay. These are wonderful. Please keep them coming. And I know folks are saying like coordination with local communities, and I totally agree and think that's wonderful. If anyone has suggestions for folks that we can contact for this coordination, I would love to get contact information. That would be very helpful. So keep it coming. Okay. So it looks like the responses have slowed. So I think that I can pass this back to Julia, or shall we just go to the next Mentimeter question?
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, this is really helpful. This is something in our project team we're trying to figure out how to incorporate, and this forum has been wonderful. There's been so many great sessions, and I see like even suggestions here in like providing education on issues, and also I thought it was interesting in prioritizing people over habitats. And there has been some common themes I've heard in the forum. I attended the Meaningful Connections with Latino session, which was really interesting. And they also said something along the lines that you have to connect the climate resilience to like education, health, faith, and to income in these conversations. And so how do we connect that then with sort of our habitat goals as well? So this is really helpful. Something we want to think more about, and we appreciate everyone's thoughts on this. So let's switch to our last Mentimeter question. We appreciate everyone hanging in there and providing such great feedback. So we wanted to wrap the session up with asking this question to everyone. In what ways could a climate resilience scorecard benefit your community? So you've heard about 3 different scorecard efforts. Some are in different phases of development, some are in the early phases, some are in later phases, some are being implemented. Did anything resonate with you throughout this session that you would think having such a tool that could actually, you could use that would benefit your community in building resilience to these changing climate impacts. Oh, I like that. Used to influence legislators. Yeah, it would be something that's more concrete, some evidence that you could talk to legislators with. Identifying areas that need to be targeted that are most crucial. Yes, targeting, that's something we talk about a lot at the Chesapeake Bay program, and I would imagine with other groups talk about as well, where would be most advantageous to actually implement these climate resilience actions for getting the most out of the investment and protecting the communities. Getting the conversation among stakeholders. Help track progress, yes. Getting a better understanding, how well are we addressing these climate impacts, and are we actually see action on the ground, or do we just have a bunch of plans and need more funding support, for instance, that may be working with legislators and working with federal agencies and state agencies to see if we can get additional funding for this effort. Useful in education, very important, having that education piece and being able to use it as a tool to help people better understand what these climate change impacts and how they affect communities. Comparative analysis, yeah, what's working, what's not working. Identify areas that need most immediate attention. These are great. Identifying vulnerabilities, yes, we have to kind of know where we're vulnerable in order to put the right strategies in place to protect us from those vulnerabilities. Yeah, I see a common theme with education, and not only to the community, but also to legislators. Help defining our priorities. I like that. Provide a quantitative indicator of health. Yeah, I always thinking like, well, how do we connect? Our environment is so important to our health as well. And so how do you create indicators to make those connections?
Julie, I just wanted to do a brief time check. We have about 7 minutes left. Are there questions from the chat that we wanted to address from earlier?
Yes, I would very much like to go back. There's some really great questions that I thought would be great for to open up to the entire group. One question we had from Gabe, this was during the RAFT presentation, but I thought it was very much suited for all the presenters. Essentially, like when you are looking at your indicators or incorporating information, what extent was your judgment qualitative or quantitative? They're asking this because there's been a discussion in climate action planning in our locality. Can these be a rough assessment or assignment, or is there a more rigorous process required to assign co-benefits like these? So I don't know, Gabe, feel free to unmute yourself and to turn on your camera if you would like to elaborate more on your question.
Sure, thank you. I'll just be brief. Yeah, so when we began a climate action planning effort in my community, I work for local government and looked at a lot of other climate action plans that were doing both mitigation and adaptation resilience. And often they would have like the icons that Angela mentioned, which to me seemed like a nice way to help folks in local government be able to prioritize, particularly people who might not be, climate might not be their focus. So a helpful way to make it understandable, and a helpful way to make it understandable and more accessible to the broader community. But we had a discussion on my team of, it was hard to tell from other localities who had done this what their method was for adding those kinds of icons to help with accessibility. And so, was it kind of like a real rigorous quantitative method where they assigned the icons, or was it more kind of like a general like value judgment? So that was since Angela mentioned having done something similar, I was curious about how you went about that.
So for us on the RAFT, it was more of a general value judgment, but for the exact reason you're saying, like to help make those connections for the localities and help them sort of catch on with different parts of the RAFT that relate to their own priorities at the local level. So, as you say, not all localities may be, quote unquote interested in climate change, but they are mostly all interested in economic development or how certain populations are being treated within their community. So to the extent we were able to point out where in the scorecard those types of elements could come to light, we thought that was helpful for them. The scorecard is fairly long and can get pretty technical. So I think it also helped just to highlight the important points and focus their attention on certain areas.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's so important trying to like figure out how communication with these scorecards. Communication is going to be key in making those connections. We did have another question from Meredith Dash. Can localities request to be part of the programs, or do you already have certain localities targeted? Have any localities been resistant to the process?
So for the RAFT, we've been focused on Virginia's coastal localities, and we've been taking more of a regional approach. So we're coordinating with the Planning District Commission at a regional level to identify sort of a manageable number of localities within their region. That seems to be, you know, around like 7 or 8 localities is about as much capacity as the RAFT team has to go through the process with them. So we work closely with the PDC, who obviously is working closely with their communities to identify who would be the best candidates to coordinate on the project. We have had, you know, some, I wouldn't necessarily say resistance so much as some localities can be more challenging to connect with. Obviously, local governments don't have a lot of resources. And since this isn't something that's necessarily required by their time, trying to just relate to them how the RAFT can be of assistance for those things that are required and how we're seeking to help build capacity, not just add another thing to their plate. So we take different approaches as far as connecting with local staff or local administration, local electeds, and trying to relay that information. Trying to identify early on what is already going on in their community regarding resilience and highlighting how we can help move that forward has been helpful, sort of meeting them where they're at. Was that all of the questions for that one? There were multiple.
Yeah, I think so. And we have some time even after the session for some further questions, but we want to do a few other wrap-up items. This has been great. As Katie May mentioned, this has been a mini workshop for a lot of these scorecard efforts and getting this input. So we would like to get a picture of the group. And so we're asking folks to turn on your camera and smile. And but if you don't want to be in the picture, go ahead and leave your camera off. So we'll give folks a minute to turn on cameras. And I think, Laura, are you going to be the one getting the screenshot for us?
I think Annie was going to do it.
And while we're doing that, I just wanted to do our final housekeeping items. So I want to ask everyone to give a virtual hand to our great speakers who did a wonderful job of preparation. And I know how hard it is to try to stay on time, and everyone did such a great job. So thank you all for that. On the sced.com link, which I'll put in the chat in a moment, you can give some feedback on this session. If you just click on the link for this session, there'll be a feedback form that opens up in a few minutes. The next session in the forum starts at 12:30, and there's a couple of options to choose from, and that'll be again on the Sched link. And then finally, the Alliance is still doing their demographic survey that they usually do when we're in person at NCTC. So please take an opportunity to fill out that demographic survey because it helps the Alliance and its partners to meet their diversity and equity and inclusion and justice goals. So I think it looks like lots of cameras are on. So whenever the photographers are ready, just let us know.
Yeah, thanks to everybody who's turning their camera on. I appreciate it. We like having these photos kind of for posterity and for our records and whatever, you know, blogging and social media we end up doing for this project. All right, so I'm just gonna use the screenshot, blah, 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 blah. Everybody smile, please. And 1, and then then I'm gonna do another one for safety in case anyone blinked. Smile and done. Great. Thank you so much, everybody. And
Yeah,
thanks for
thanks
coming out.
everyone. And we have some speakers that can stick around if there's any other questions that we didn't get to, but feel free to hop off if you need that break. We're just going to stick around for 5 more minutes, and if there's no other questions, that's fine as well. And feel free to unmute yourself if you have an additional question or stick it in the chat.
This is Meredith. I have one more question. Is there any forward thinking on taking those scorecards and turning them into more like a brochure or publication that then can be handed to legislators, so that, or the community at large, or educators, so they can use them in classrooms or for educational purposes?
So I can answer that. Our report cards actually do go to legislators as report cards. We also have more technical documents available if they ask for them, but legislators and policymakers are part of our target audience for report cards. And the fact is, our report card is being funded by the government, and we're really looking to find ways that can help improve resiliency and adaptation in coastal counties. So this will be going back to the state government, and it could go up to the federal government.
Great, thank you.
Oh, we have an interesting question in the chat. Is there some way to use the scorecard to emphasize the consequences of not considering resilience? I don't know if any of our speakers have any thoughts on that question.
This is a little something that the project team, or my project team was talking about kind of yesterday, was incorporating whether you can incorporate climate projections into the information in the scorecard. So do you have things like intensity, duration, and frequency curves available for where you are, so that you know how precipitation might change in the future? And so that you can say, you can kind of actually know the size of the gap that you might be trying to close with your resilience plan. So it's like resilience for what? So that's something that we've been starting to think about. And so if people have suggestions about, like indicators that would be useful in communicating, if we don't close this gap, what would happen? But that's something that we're thinking about how to include. So it's definitely on our minds, but we're at the early stages of the project, so we don't have an answer for how we would do that yet.
And I guess for the RAFT, this comes up early on whenever we are doing the presentation to the local governing body. We try to include historic data that relates to what residents within the community might be seeing as far as flooding, and then also try to include some projections for what they might be seeing in the future, to sort of stress that point of, it's not necessarily going to be getting better. We're not sure exactly what's going to happen, but it's probably going to get worse. And they often can point to different types of projections, but we try to emphasize that although, the curves may change, generally speaking, they're not getting any better. They're usually getting worse. So we try to get as much input as we can from, say, people serving on the Board of Supervisors and what they're experiencing at their own property, and relate that back to what they may have been experiencing when they were children. And if they've been seeing a difference over that time frame, trying to show that they'll continue to see a change as it moves forward.
Can I weigh in? I think this is it's an ongoing problem for us to communicate to people the consequences of inaction. And, you know, we see it again and again. We see it in COVID, we see it in global warming, you know, we're warning about things that may happen in the future. And how, I don't know if there's some way to pull on past experiences and say, you know, like, for instance, about this crisis that occurred before, if we would have prepared for it, it would have cost this much less. Or we would have had this many fewer deaths, or housing prices would not have plummeted by 50% on this island, or whatever. So that, because we're just constantly stuck in this Cassandra role of warning about the future and trying to guide people toward a better future, when our experience is repeatedly that people don't pay attention until the crisis is right on top of them.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're very much a reactive society than a proactive society, it seems like, with when we're dealing with these hazards and emergencies. Yeah, my thought, just like attending some other sessions with this forum and with other forums, you have to like strike a balance between providing hope and solutions, and also trying to convey that message. If we don't do anything, this is what we're gonna be faced with. So yeah, it's, to me, a very delicate balance, but I think that part of the piece is important. I think it's going to be important to try to sort out, like, well, what's the best way to communicate it? Because we want to also relay that message of like solution seeking, and, you know, that there is hope. But if we don't do anything, it is important to know what the consequences of that is as well. And yeah, so there is a balance to strike to try to accomplish that goal. And I think it's interesting. I think with the RAND Corporation, they're very much involved in looking at projections. So it'd be interesting to see how that can get feed into the Chesapeake Bay program climate resilience scorecard effort. But yeah, also thinking, okay, you know, if we would have done this, we would have been in a better place today. So yeah, well, we may have to think a little bit more on that. Thank you for bringing that up. All right. Well, I think I don't see any other questions coming in, and I know breaks are important, and for folks to get some lunch before the next session. I want to thank again all the speakers. This was great, and we will be providing the Mentimeter results to all the scorecard groups, so you can use that for your different efforts. And so Breck and I will try to get to that to you as soon as possible. And thanks, Jen and Laura, for all your help in helping us organize this session.
Yeah, thank you all. Great preparation. It was a great session.
Yep. All right. Thanks.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Happy Halloween.
Happy
Halloween.